In the blistering summer of AD 378, beneath the burning skies of Thrace, the Roman Empire met its darkest hour. At Adrianople, legions marched with pride, only to be swallowed by fire and steel. Emperor Valens fell, his body consumed in flames, as two-thirds of Rome's eastern army perished in a single day. This was not just a battle lost, it was the shattering of an illusion, the nightfall of Roman invincibility. Stay with us as we unravel the tragedy of Adrianople, where arrogance doomed an emperor and the empire itself trembled on the edge of ruin. Witness the rise of Theodosius and discover how Rome clawed back from the abyss. Subscribe for more epic history. The summer of AD 378 bore down upon Thrace with merciless heat. Dust rose in choking clouds as the eastern Roman legions advanced across the dry plains. Their banners shimmered in the haze, the golden eagles of Rome glinting defiantly beneath the blazing sun. At their head rode Emperor Valens, the man entrusted with the fate of the East. He was no novice in the art of war, but ambition and pride clouded his judgment, and on this day, his decisions would plunge the empire into ruin. For months, whispers of Gothic incursions had haunted the frontier. These were no longer scattered raiding parties, but entire nations on the move. Families, warriors, chiefs, and kings. Driven by hunger, betrayal, and desperation, the Goths surged across the Danube and carved a path of devastation. Valens had been assured by his advisors that the enemy numbered no more than 10 or 15,000, weary from famine and disunity. What he faced on the fields near Adrianople was an enemy far more numerous, hardened and united under the cunning leadership of Fritigern. The Roman army that gathered was formidable on paper: infantry legions seasoned in war, cavalry units drawn from the eastern provinces, and auxiliaries who had long fought under Rome's banner. Yet beneath the surface of this iron host lay cracks. Supplies ran short in the oppressive heat, morale wavered, and the unity of command frayed. Valens had hesitated to wait for reinforcements from the west, led by his nephew Gratian, fearing that the young co-emperor might claim the glory of victory for himself. Pride demanded that he act alone. On the morning of August 9th, the legions marched to meet their enemy. The Goths had encamped in a wagon fort, circling their wagons into a defensive ring, a barbarian stronghold bristling with spears. Scouts returned with alarming reports. The Gothic cavalry, the fearsome mounted warriors whose charges could shatter entire lines, were absent. Valens misread this absence as weakness. In truth, the horsemen had been dispatched to forage, and their return would soon tip the balance of fate. As the sun reached its zenith, the Romans advanced. The heat was unbearable, soldiers collapsing from thirst, their armor baking their flesh. Dust blinded their eyes as the first volleys of arrows whistled from the Gothic camp. The legionaries pressed forward, their shields locked, their discipline unbroken. For a moment it seemed that Roman might would prevail. Then the ground thundered. From beyond the hills, the Gothic cavalry returned, black silhouettes against the shimmering horizon. They descended like a storm, their charge splitting the Roman lines with irresistible force. Panic spread. Cohorts wavered, auxiliaries fled, and discipline disintegrated. The carefully ordered Roman formation dissolved into chaos as the Goths pressed the advantage, raining death from all sides. Valens fought desperately to rally his men, but the tide had turned. Surrounded, hemmed in by fire and steel, the Eastern army was swallowed by annihilation. Legionary standards toppled into the dust. The cries of the dying echoed across the plain, mingling with the clash of steel and the thunder of hooves. Two-thirds of the Roman force was butchered in the relentless slaughter. The emperor himself vanished in the maelstrom. Accounts vary. Some claim he fell by an arrow, others that he was carried wounded into a farmhouse, which the Goths set ablaze. What is certain is that Valens perished in fire. His body never recovered. The Emperor of Rome died not in triumph, but consumed by the very flames that marked his empire's humiliation. When the smoke cleared, the field was a charnel house. Tens of thousands of Roman dead littered the ground, their armor stripped, their bodies left to the scavengers. It was not merely a defeat, it was a cataclysm. The Eastern Roman army, pride of the empire, had ceased to exist in a single afternoon. The news spread like wildfire. Constantinople trembled, its gates braced against the oncoming Goths. To friend and foe alike, the Battle of Adrianople was more than a disaster. It was the end of the illusion that Rome was invincible. For the first time in centuries, the empire had been shattered not by treachery within or rival claimants to the throne, but by the raw might of a barbarian host. And as night fell upon the blood-soaked plain, so too did night fall upon Rome's invincibility. Out of the ashes of Adrianople, Rome staggered like a wounded beast. Its emperor was gone, its armies broken, and its enemies emboldened. In such moments of crisis, the empire often produced unlikely saviors, men who rose not from dynasties of kings, but from the crucible of war itself. One such figure was Flavius Theodosius, a soldier of Spain, hardened by campaigns, disciplined by tragedy, and destined to bear the weight of Rome upon his shoulders. Theodosius was the son of a respected general, Flavius Theodosius the Elder, whose career had been marked by loyalty and battlefield success. Yet loyalty in Rome was often rewarded with suspicion. The elder Theodosius had fallen victim to court intrigues, condemned to death in a purge of imperial paranoia. His son witnessed this grim fate, and from it learned that the empire he served was both majestic and merciless. To survive in such a world, he cultivated patience, discretion, and a keen sense for the hidden tides of power. By the time Adrianople cast its long shadow, Theodosius was already a seasoned officer. He had fought in Britannia against the restless tribes and in Africa against insurgents who tested Rome's grip on its provinces. His reputation was not of flamboyant brilliance, but of steady reliability, qualities often overlooked until desperation forced Rome to seek them. In the wake of Valens' death, the Eastern Empire teetered on collapse. The Gothic host roamed unchecked, threatening the very heart of Constantinople. Panic rippled through the capital. Courtiers whispered of divine punishment, of omens foretelling the empire's doom. In the west, the young Emperor Gratian was overwhelmed by his own troubles along the Rhine, where Alemanni raiders struck with impunity. He needed a man he could trust to stabilize the east, a man neither too ambitious to challenge his throne, nor too weak to command armies. His choice fell upon Theodosius. When summoned to power in 379, Theodosius did not stride into Constantinople like a conqueror. He came as a weary soldier, aware of the magnitude of his task. He inherited not a throne of gold, but a crumbling frontier, a devastated army, and a populace paralyzed by fear. To many, the appointment seemed almost cruel, a burden too great for one man. But Theodosius accepted it with the quiet resolve of one who understood that survival, not glory, was the measure of his duty. The first challenge he faced was the army. The legions of the East were shattered, their officers slain, their veterans buried beneath the soil of Thrace. Theodosius knew he could not rebuild overnight. Instead, he drew upon every available source of manpower, recruiting peasants from the provinces, recalling deserters with promises of pardon, even integrating barbarian foederati into his ranks. Critics scoffed that he was diluting Rome's strength with unreliable elements. Theodosius saw it differently. Survival demanded pragmatism. Rome could no longer afford the arrogance of purity, yet his genius lay not only in recruitment, but in patience. Where Valens had rushed headlong into battle, Theodosius hesitated. He refused to gamble what little remained of Rome's strength on rash confrontations. Instead, he fortified positions, harassed enemy foragers, and wove a web of defenses that slowed the Gothic advance. His caution earned him scorn from those who demanded swift vengeance, but it bought time for the shattered empire to breathe, to regroup, to mend its wounds. Amid these military reforms, Theodosius revealed another talent rare among Roman generals: diplomacy. He understood the Goths were not a mere horde to be crushed, but a people seeking survival. Fritigern had welded them into a force of unprecedented unity, but even unity frayed under the weight of hunger and exhaustion. Theodosius opened negotiations, offering terms that acknowledged the Goths not simply as enemies but as potential allies. To many Romans, such gestures seemed unthinkable, an insult to the majesty of the empire. But Theodosius saw beyond pride. He sought not annihilation, but integration. This dual approach, Measured war and cautious peace marked him as a new kind of Roman leader. He was no Caesar, no Alexander striding across continents with unquenchable ambition. He was a healer, stitching together the torn fabric of an empire bleeding from its wounds. And yet, within his restraint burned an iron will. He would not allow Rome to die on his watch. His personal life mirrored his political mission. In Constantinople, he presented himself not as a distant ruler, but as a man of piety and discipline. He attended church, prayed publicly, and won the trust of both clergy and people. At a time when Rome was riven by theological disputes, Theodosius projected unity through faith. He would later become known as Theodosius the Great, not for his conquest, but for binding the empire's spiritual identity as firmly as its military defenses. Still, in these early years, his task was precarious. Gothic raiders prowled the countryside, plundering villages, while Roman farmers deserted their lands in terror. Each day brought rumors of new defeats, new betrayals. Theodosius bore them all with stoic endurance. When his health faltered, he suffered from recurring illness, perhaps a lingering fever from his campaigns. He retreated briefly to recover, only to return to the front with renewed determination. To his soldiers, he was not a distant emperor, but a commander who shared their hardships. He marched with them through mud and snow, endured the same rations, and stood beside them in the uncertainty of battle. Legends spread of his calm presence under pressure, his ability to steady a wavering line with a word, his refusal to despair even when outnumbered. These stories gave the men something Rome had almost lost: hope. From the smoking ruins of Adrianople's disaster, Flavius Theodosius began to weave the threads of resilience. He did not promise swift revenge. He did not boast of inevitable victory. Instead, he offered something deeper: the assurance that Rome could endure, adapt, and rise again. In him, the empire found not the glory of the past, but the promise of survival for the future. Out of defeat, a hero had emerged, not by thunderous conquest, but by the quiet strength of endurance, wisdom, and resolve. And in that strength, Rome would find its path forward. The catastrophe at Adrianople did not end on the battlefield. Its shock waves reverberated through every marble hall and every crowded street of the Eastern Empire. Word of the disaster raced faster than any messenger could gallop. By the time the first ragged survivors stumbled into Constantinople, the city already buzzed with whispers, rumors of annihilation, of an emperor burned alive, of legions swallowed whole. The people of Constantinople had always regarded their capital as an impregnable jewel. Its towering Theodosian walls, its mighty fleet anchored in the Golden Horn, its wealth drawn from every corner of the East, all seemed to promise safety. But now the illusion cracked. If Rome's armies could vanish in a single afternoon, what defense could even the strongest walls provide? Mothers clutched their children in fear. Merchants shuttered their shops, and the clergy filled the churches with prayers of desperate supplication. In the imperial palace, chaos reigned. Valens' death left a vacuum at the very heart of government. Courtiers, generals, and administrators vied for influence, whispering accusations and plotting survival. Some demanded immediate retaliation, others counseled retreat and appeasement. None could mask their terror. It was not simply a battle that had been lost. It was the prestige of Rome itself, the aura of invincibility that had shielded the empire for centuries. The Senate, such as it remained in the East, was paralyzed. Senators who once boasted of Rome's eternal dominion now muttered that perhaps the gods had abandoned them. Pagan voices decried the empire's growing embrace of Christianity, blaming the new faith for Rome's military weakness. Christian bishops countered that the catastrophe was punishment for the emperor's sins and for the arrogance of his court. In every quarter, people searched for meaning, for some explanation of how the greatest empire the world had ever known could be humiliated by tribes once dismissed as barbarians. Meanwhile, the Goths advanced. Fritigern's warriors swept across Thrace, torching farms, pillaging villages, and leaving a trail of ruin in their wake. Refugees flooded into the capital, their stories thick with horror. Entire towns burned, children carried off into slavery, Roman soldiers hunted down like beasts in the forests. Panic gnawed at the city's spirit. Some citizens prepared to flee by sea, while others fortified their homes in fear of a siege. The The specter of the Goths at the gates loomed larger with each passing week. The memory of past barbarian incursions paled beside this new threat. These Goths were not mere raiders seeking plunder before retreating to their forests. They were a nation in arms, their families and chieftains united, seeking not spoils but land, Roman land, to call their own. Inside Constantinople, the atmosphere grew fevered. Street preachers declared the end of days. Astrologers sold predictions of Rome's fall to anxious crowds. The clamor of the marketplace fell silent as coin lost its value. Wealth could not purchase safety when the empire itself trembled. In the military ranks, despair threatened to rot discipline. Soldiers cursed their fate, murmuring that Rome had become too soft, too decadent to survive. Veterans who had once marched proudly under the eagles now muttered of desertion. The officers struggled to enforce order, but even their voices quavered with doubt. For centuries, the legions had been Rome's pride, the hammer that crushed all foes. Now, after Adrianople, the hammer itself was shattered, and no one knew if it could be reforged. Gratian, the young Western emperor, sought to reassure his subjects and allies, but his words rang hollow. He had barely escaped his own disasters along the Rhine, and his authority stretched thin. The empire seemed adrift, split between East and West, neither strong enough to shoulder the burden alone. Rival claimants whispered of seizing power. The very unity of Rome threatened to unravel. For the first time since the days of Hannibal, an enemy stood poised to exploit Rome's weakness on such a scale. The parallel was not lost on the people. Then Rome had found strength in the resilience of Scipio Africanus. But now, who could fill that role? Who would lead the empire from despair to survival? It was in this crucible of fear that Flavius Theodosius was elevated. To some, his appointment seemed almost laughable. A provincial commander, not of senatorial blood, untested against foes of such magnitude. But to others, the very ordinariness of his rise gave hope. He was not a creature of the decadent court, not another arrogant aristocrat blind to reality. He was a soldier, forged in the mud of Britannia and the deserts of Africa, a man who had seen the empire not from its marble palaces, but from its bleeding frontiers. Still, his path was uncertain. Even as he took command, the empire quivered like a great edifice with cracks running through its foundation. One push from the Goths might topple it entirely. Theodosius inherited not a throne of majesty, but a burden of despair. Constantinople looked to him with eyes wide in terror, asking the unspoken question, could one man hold back the tide? The empire trembled, and for a moment all seemed lost. But history teaches that Rome's greatest tests often summoned its greatest answers. The fall of Valens was not the end, but the prelude. From within the quaking heart of Constantinople, the empire would find the strength to endure, not by denying its wounds, but by facing them. And Theodosius, the unlikely savior, would become the steady hand upon which Rome's fate would rest. To understand the terror that gripped Rome after Adrianople, one must understand the enemy who had inflicted the blow. For centuries, the Goths had haunted the empire's northern frontier, sometimes allies, sometimes raiders, always restless. Yet never before had they appeared as they did in the late 4th century, a people transformed by suffering, united by necessity, and led by a chieftain of uncommon vision, Fritigern. The Goths were not a mere band of marauders. They were a nation on the move, an entire people uprooted from their ancestral homelands along the Danube, driven south by the relentless advance of the Huns, horsemen from the steppes whose savagery even the Goths feared. They had turned to Rome not as invaders, but as supplicants. They crossed the Danube seeking asylum, offering loyalty in exchange for land within the empire. Valens, eager to use them as a buffer against other barbarians, had granted permission. But Rome's promise became Rome's betrayal. Corrupt officials extorted the refugees, selling them dog meat at the price of gold, enslaving their children and starving the masses who had entrusted their future to Roman mercy. Hunger turned to fury, and fury turned to war. When the Goths finally rose in rebellion, they did so not as scattered clans, but as a desperate people bound by shared injustice. At their head stood Fritigern. Unlike many barbarian chiefs, he was no mere warlord intoxicated by plunder. He was a strategist, a negotiator, and above all, a leader who understood how to channel desperation into unity. He forged alliances between rival Gothic factions, persuading them to set aside blood feuds in pursuit of survival. He exploited Rome's arrogance, luring Valens into battle on terms favorable to the Goths. At Adrianople, his vision bore its terrible fruit. Fritigern's genius lay in turning weakness into strength. His people lacked Rome's discipline, its siege engines, its organized legions, but they possessed mobility, ferocity, and a will sharpened by betrayal. Their cavalry, in particular, was unmatched. Heavy Gothic horsemen who could crash into infantry lines like an avalanche, and nimble riders who harried enemies with relentless skirmishes. Rome had once dismissed these warriors as barbarians. Now it feared them as the equal of any legion. The aftermath of Adrianople revealed how far the Goths had come. No longer content with raids, they moved as conquerors. Villages fell before them, cities trembled at their approach. Though they lacked the machinery to storm Constantinople itself, their presence outside its walls sent shivers through the empire. For the first time, the eastern capital lived in fear of being overrun by a foreign people who sought not tribute but territory. Fritigern's aims were clear: to carve a permanent homeland for his people within the empire. This was no temporary rebellion to be crushed and forgotten. It was the birth of a Gothic nation, born in fire and blood on Roman soil. To the citizens of Constantinople, the implications were chilling. If the Goths succeeded, Rome would no longer be master of its own land. The empire would become host to a rival people within its borders, undermining the very foundation of Roman authority. What made the threat more dire was the Gothic spirit itself. Rome's strength had always lain in its discipline, its ability to impose order upon chaos. The Goths thrived in chaos. Their warriors fought not for pay or plunder alone, but for their families, who traveled with the army in wagons, forming a moving nation that followed wherever victory led. Every battle was not merely a clash of arms, but a fight for survival. Such determination could not easily be broken. Rome's leaders understood this with mounting dread. Unlike the Alemanni or the Franks, who raided and withdrew, the Goths could not be driven back across the frontier. There was no frontier left. They were already inside the empire. To expel them would require more than a victory. It would require annihilation. And after Adrianople, annihilation seemed beyond Rome's reach. Meanwhile, the legend of the Gothic victory spread far beyond Thrace. Other tribes watched with keen eyes. If the Goths could humble Rome, why not they? The Vandals, the Suebi, the Alans, all saw in Adrianople proof that the empire was no longer invincible. The battle emboldened barbarians across Europe, stoking the fires of rebellion and ambition. Rome had not merely lost a battle, it had opened the floodgates of barbarian confidence. Yet Fritigern remained cautious. He knew his people could not yet replace Rome, nor could they risk being crushed if the empire rallied. He alternated between terror and negotiation, raiding when it suited him, offering peace when convenient. It was a strategy designed to exhaust Rome, to keep the empire off balance while the Goths solidified their hold. For the Romans, this ambiguity was maddening. Was Fritigern a conqueror bent on Rome's destruction, or a would-be ally seeking recognition? The truth was both. He was pragmatic, seeking whatever advantage might secure his people's survival. But beneath his diplomacy burned a ruthless resolve. Never again would the Goths be at Rome's mercy. Thus, Rome faced not only a military adversary, but a new kind of enemy, an enemy who fought with both sword and strategy, who understood Rome's weaknesses and exploited them with precision. Against such a foe, arrogance was fatal and hesitation deadly. In the shadow of Fritigern's triumph, Rome confronted an unbearable truth. The barbarians it had long despised were no longer on the fringes of history. They had stepped onto its very stage, and they would not easily be removed. The enemy had risen, and the empire trembled before him. The empire had survived disasters before. Hannibal at Cannae, the Persians at Carrhae, even the sack of Rome by the Gauls centuries earlier. Each had seemed fatal, yet each had been endured. But Adrianople was different. It was not a single city lost, nor a frontier temporarily breached. It was the heart of the Eastern army crushed, an emperor burned alive, and a people suddenly vulnerable in their own homeland. In this abyss of despair, one man began to chart a path not of vengeance, but of survival. Flavius Theodosius. From the moment he assumed command in 379, Theodosius recognized that the empire could not be restored by pride alone. Rome's legions lay in ruins, its treasury drained, its people demoralized. To pretend otherwise would be folly. Where Valens had been blinded by arrogance, Theodosius embraced realism. He knew Rome's strength lay not only in arms, but in adaptability. And so he set about reshaping the empire's defense with patience, strategy, and relentless pragmatism. His first task was to rebuild the army. The veterans who had fallen at Adrianople could not be replaced overnight. But Theodosius scraped together every resource. He offered amnesty to deserters if they would return to service, promising forgiveness in exchange for loyalty. He recruited from the provinces, drawing farmers and townsmen into the legions. He even went further, opening Rome's ranks to barbarians, foederati, who would fight under their own chiefs but in Rome's service. To traditionalists, this was sacrilege. How could the empire entrust its fate to the very peoples who had slaughtered its legions? Yet Theodosius saw no alternative. Rome needed manpower, and pride could not fill the ranks. But recruitment was only the beginning. Discipline had to be restored. Theodosius drilled his new soldiers relentlessly, instilling cohesion where chaos had reigned. He placed trusted officers at every level, men chosen not for their birth, but for their competence. Slowly, the army began to resemble a force capable of facing the Goths, not the proud legions of old, but a patchwork host bound together by necessity and hope. Even as he rebuilt his forces, Theodosius pursued diplomacy with equal vigor. He understood that Rome could not win by war alone. The Goths were too numerous, too determined, and too entrenched within imperial territory. Total destruction was impossible. Coexistence had to be considered. Where Valens had dismissed negotiation as weakness, Theodosius wielded it as a weapon. He opened talks with Fritigern and other Gothic leaders, offering land, rations, and recognition in exchange for peace. These negotiations were not acts of submission, but of strategy. By treating the Goths as foederati, federated allies rather than conquered subjects, Theodosius sought to transform enemies into partners. This arrangement allowed the empire to redirect Gothic strength rather than exhaust itself in futile attempts at annihilation. For the Goths, it offered survival and dignity. For Rome, it offered breathing space. The policy was controversial. Many Romans saw it as capitulation, a betrayal of centuries of dominance. To them, the Goths were barbarians who had humiliated the empire and deserved only extermination. But Theodosius ignored the cries for vengeance. He understood what his critics did not, that Rome's survival required compromise. The days of absolute supremacy were fading, and only by adapting could the empire endure. Theodosius also turned his attention to the spiritual fabric of the empire. He was a devout Christian, and in a time of crisis, faith became a rallying point. By promoting Christianity as the state religion, he offered a unifying identity that transcended ethnic divisions. Soldiers, citizens, and even some barbarians could find common cause beneath the cross. It was not merely theology, but strategy, an attempt to bind the fractured empire with belief as well as law. His leadership was tested repeatedly. Gothic bands continued to raid, sometimes breaking truces, sometimes challenging Roman authority. Theodosius responded with a mixture of firmness and patience. When necessary, he fought, deploying his rebuilt forces to check Gothic advances. But he avoided reckless gambles. He never allowed himself to be lured into another Adrianople. Every engagement was measured, every concession calculated. He wore down his enemies not with a single stroke, but with the slow grind of persistence. At times, his health faltered. Theodosius suffered from recurring illness, bouts of fever that forced him from the field. In his absence, generals faltered, and enemies pressed harder. Yet each time he returned, rallying his men with quiet determination. His resilience became a symbol. If the emperor himself could endure weakness and rise again, so too could Rome. Gradually, stability returned. Villages once abandoned were resettled. Trade resumed along the great roads. Constantinople no longer trembled with every rumor of Gothic advance. The empire had not triumphed, but it had survived, and survival was victory enough after Adrianople. The culmination of Theodosius's efforts came in 382, when a formal treaty was struck with the Goths. They were granted land within the empire, not as subjects but as allies bound to provide soldiers for Rome's armies. To many Romans, it was an unthinkable compromise, barbarians dwelling legally within the empire's borders. But Theodosius saw beyond the outrage. The treaty transformed a mortal threat into a managed reality. It bought time, precious time for the empire to recover, reorganize, and endure. It was not a glorious settlement. It did not erase the humiliation of Adrianople. The Goths remained within Rome, their presence a constant reminder of vulnerability. Yet for all its flaws, the treaty embodied Theodosius's genius. He had not won by conquest, but by adaptation, by redefining what it meant to be Roman in a world where the old certainties had crumbled. In Theodosius, Rome found not a conqueror, but a guardian. He did not promise the restoration of past glories, but the preservation of future survival. He proved that resilience could be as heroic as victory, that compromise could be as powerful as conquest. Through him, the empire discovered that even in defeat, there was a path to endurance. Adrianople had shattered the illusion of Rome's invincibility, but Theodosius forged something more enduring than illusion, the reality of survival. Rome lived on, not unscathed, not unbroken, but alive. And in a world suddenly filled with enemies, that alone was triumph. The smoke of Adrianople lingered for years, not only in the blackened fields of Thrace, but in the hearts of Romans across the empire. The memory of slaughter could not be erased. It became a scar upon the imperial psyche, a reminder that Rome was mortal. Yet scars can harden flesh. And out of the ashes of despair rose a new resolve. Thanks to Theodosius, Rome found its footing once more, not through the thunder of conquest, but through the quiet strength of survival. By 382, the treaty with the Goths had secured a fragile peace. For the first time since the disaster, the eastern provinces could breathe. Farmers returned to their fields, marketplaces reopened, and roads once stalked by raiders hummed again with commerce. The empire had not won glory, but it had won time. And time was a gift Rome knew how to use. Theodosius turned this respite into renewal. He strengthened the defenses of Constantinople, reinforcing its mighty walls and harbors. He reorganized the army into smaller, more flexible units, limitanae and comitatenses, able to respond swiftly to incursions rather than relying on vast, lumbering legions. He integrated foederati into the imperial structure, binding their loyalty with land and honor. Rome was no longer the monolith of Caesar or Trajan, but a mosaic of peoples stitched together by necessity. The change was not merely military. Theodosius infused the empire with new purpose. By making Christianity the official religion, he gave Romans a spiritual identity that transcended their wounds. No longer was Rome defined only by conquest or bloodlines. It was defined by faith, by the promise of eternal endurance. Temples gave way to churches, and crucifixes replaced eagle standards as symbols of unity. To the faithful, Rome was not just an empire of stone and steel, but the chosen guardian of God's order on earth. Yet peace was never certain. The Goths remained within the empire, proud and restless. Their chieftains still remembered the humiliation inflicted by Valens, and their warriors still carried the memory of Adrianople as a badge of honor. But Theodosius managed them with a careful hand. He reminded them that Rome's enemies were not only Goths, but Persians, Huns, and countless others who lurked beyond the frontiers. He turned former foes into soldiers of the cross, redirecting their fury against common threats. This was the essence of Rome's rebirth, not a return to supremacy, but a transformation of identity. Where arrogance had destroyed Valens, adaptability preserved Theodosius. Rome no longer sought to dominate by sheer force. It sought to endure through resilience, through the art of turning even disaster into strength. The high point of this rebirth came not on the battlefield, but in the halls of Constantinople. In 380, Theodosius issued the Edict of Thessalonica, declaring Nicene Christianity the sole official faith of the empire. With one decree, he bound millions under a shared creed. This was not merely religion, it was politics, strategy, survival. By uniting his people in spirit, he ensured that no matter what foe battered Rome's gates, the empire would endure as long as its heart remained steadfast. Yet Theodosius was no mere priest-king. When the time came, he proved himself on the field as well. In 394, he marched west to confront the usurper Eugenius and the pagan general Arbogast. The battle at the Frigidus River was brutal, a clash that tested the empire's resolve. But Theodosius triumphed, his victory cementing his role as the sole ruler of East and West. For the last time in history, Rome stood united under a single emperor. Theodosius's triumph was not just political, it was symbolic. It showed that Rome could still summon strength, still rally under a leader, still command the loyalty of men from Spain to Syria, from Gaul to Egypt. The empire might no longer expand as in centuries past, but it was far from dead. It was transformed, tempered by fire into something new, an empire of survival rather than conquest. And yet, even as the phoenix rose, shadows gathered. The treaty with the Goths had bought peace, but it had also planted seeds of future storms. By granting them land and autonomy, Theodosius ensured their survival within the empire, but at the cost of Roman control. These foederati would one day grow restless, their descendants clashing again with Rome in battles that would shake the West to its foundations. But that lay in the future. In the time of Theodosius, Rome breathed again. Its cities stood, its roads pulsed with life, its armies marched beneath banners of the cross. The disaster of Adrianople had not ended the empire. It had forced it to evolve, to shed illusions of invincibility and embrace the harder truth of resilience. This was the true rebirth, not the denial of defeat, but its transformation into strength. Rome no longer claimed to be untouchable. Instead, it claimed to be unbreakable. And so long as men like Theodosius guided its destiny, the empire would endure, battered but unbowed. Thus, the story of Adrianople did not end in fire and ruin. It ended in survival, in renewal, in the stubborn refusal of Rome to die. The legions may have perished, an emperor may have fallen, but the idea of Rome, the eternal city, the eternal empire, lived on. From the smoldering fields of Thrace to the soaring domes of Constantinople, one message rang clear. Rome could bleed, Rome could stumble, but Rome would never surrender.